Hello class, here I am again. The video last week I trust came out all right and none of you used it to scare the children, which is good. So here's another video. This week we're talking about chapter 10, which is the chapter on sexual disorders and gender identity disorders as well. There is a move to change the way we talk about gender identity disorder and not talk about it so much as a disorder. Because most of the transgender people I've met are not particularly disordered once they recognize their gender issues, and those issues get addressed through hormones and surgery. What I've included for your reading this week are a couple of letters that I've written for people that are going on to surgery, and you'll find those kind of interesting. The textbook has a good outline of what some of the diagnostic criteria are for the gender identity disorders, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that on the lecture today. Chapter 10 has a broad range of sexual issues that it addresses, and some of them are cultural. For example, I think I may have mentioned in an earlier lecture that fetishism is a diagnosis in the DSM-4, but nowadays we're less apt to diagnose it as a pathology unless it's a problem. For example, if two consenting adults in the privacy of their bedroom want to use sex toys or bondage or any of that for arousal, for sexual play, I think most psychologists today would be hard-pressed to pathologize that and call it a disorder. It becomes a disorder when it causes impairment or when it's forced upon one partner at the behest of the other. But generally speaking, we don't spend a lot of time pathologizing sexual play. There are other sexual issues, however, that are pathological. For example, the paraphilias, and specifically one that I deal with as a forensic psychologist a great deal is the pedophilia, which is attraction to children. Now, it was once believed that women were not pedophiles at all, that women were incapable of sexual abuse. We know that to be wrong today, but they still number very low among sex offenders. Actually, sex offenders, about maybe 5 to 8% of sex offenders are women, and the remaining sex offenders are men. There are some things we know about sex offenders in the research that I think the text talks about to some extent, and then I've done a lot of research on it, obviously, because of my work as a forensic psychologist. We know that sex offenders are usually male, that there are some psychosocial characteristics that make a person riskier to be an offender. For example, people who are socially awkward or socially isolated. A lot of the sex offenders that I evaluate are very socially awkward people who just don't relate well to people their own age. And so they turn to children for sexual gratification and for manipulation. People who have a certain antisocial tendencies, people who commit violent crimes, are more likely to sexually offend than people who do not commit violent crimes. So if there's an antisocial edge, particularly violent antisocial edge to a person, then that is a risk for sexually offending. Substance abuse is also a risk for sexually offending. There are some myths out there about sexual reactivity and sexual behavior as well. In the 1970s and 1980s, it was believed that if a child acted out sexually, it was almost automatically presumed that that child had been sexually abused. We know now that there are lots of reasons why children act out sexually. The number one reason why children act out sexually is exposure to domestic violence, and secondly, exposure to untreated adult mental health problems, with sex abuse being very low actually on the list of reasons why a child might act out sexually. Now, if a child acts out sexually, you certainly want to have that checked out by a forensic interviewer, but more often than not, the cause of a child's sexually reactive behavior is not sexual abuse. That's a myth that was really debunked in the 1990s and even today with a lot of longitudinal scientific research. The treatment for sex offenders varies. Sometimes it's successful to simply teach empathy about children and about the victims, to help a person gain insight into why they do what they do. There's also what's commonly referred to as chemical castration, which is giving the person spironolactone or some other agent that reduces androgen, which is the male hormone in the body, and that reduces sexual desire. So there are people who undergo that form of treatment as well. Some people are really hard to treat, and some people reoffend, and that's why we have very strict registries in most states now for sex offenders, just so we know where they are. We can kind of control their movement and their access to children, which is very important to ensure the safety of children. There are other sexual dysfunctions that are mentioned in the book. There are certainly sexual attraction disorders, sexual arousal disorders. You can't turn on television today without seeing a Viagra commercial. So there are physical causes for sexual arousal disorders in men that seem to be treated medically, and it's a big industry nowadays. But there are sexual arousal and sexual desire disorders as well. As you probably know from history, in 1970, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. That's not to say that gay and lesbian people can't have other mental health issues like depression, anxiety, all the other mental health issues that other people have. But homosexuality is not considered pathological. It is estimated that anywhere from, the estimates widely range, that anywhere from 1% to 10% of the general population is homosexual or has reported themselves to be engaged in a homosexual relationship at some point in their life. And it's certainly much more accepted today than it was years ago. There have been some twin studies that show that dizygotic twins, in other words, fraternal or non-identical twins, don't tend to share the same sexual orientation, but identical twins, even separated at birth, more often than not, share the same sexual orientation, which leads researchers to believe that there might be a biological basis for sexual orientation. And the jury is still out on that. There hasn't been a lot of research on it. So read Chapter 10, read the evaluations, go to the discussion board. The discussion board will be talking specifically about the material on gender identity that is included in those letters. And I hope you enjoy the reading and find it interesting. I believe all of you have gotten your paper topics into me, your wiki topics, but if you haven't, you really need to do that, like right now after you get done watching this video. You can post to the wiki anytime. It's now week 5. A couple more weeks will be the deadline, so you can do that anytime. You don't have to wait till the last week to do it. And I look forward to seeing you on the discussion board. Talk to you later.